Just as a quick introduction, David is an independent futurist, consultant and writer at Delta Wisdom and the chair of London Futurists, where he has organized regular meetings in London mostly on futurist topics and techno-progressive topics. His talk will be about anticipating changes in public attitude towards death and cryonics.
Many thanks for the invitation to be part of such a fascinating conference. I will start with a number of confessions. First confession is I'm not a scientist, but on the other hand, I have studied quite seriously the philosophy of science, and I'm more than happy to argue with people whether the scientific language of cryonics is good science or bad science. And also in my background, I had 25 years of experience in high tech, in the mobile computing and smartphone industries, where I saw innovations move from being fringe and strange, then with the earlier smartphones, into mass adoption, although I also saw many examples of possible innovations not taking off at all. I'm a friend of the cryonics community. I have been tracking with interest what's going on in this community for a couple of decades, but I have to confess I am still a cryocrastinator. I have not got my arrangements with any cryonics provider sorted out. In fact, I would call myself a level 2 cryocrastinator. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I am the chair of London Futurists, but in this talk, I will not be saying what I think the future definitely holds. I'll be outlining some issues about the future, but also the past of cryonics. And in this case, I'll be quite happy to be proved wrong with some of my assertions. Having said that, let's move on to my talk, anticipating changes, possible changes in public attitudes towards death and cryonics. So as a futurist, let me draw a timeline with 5 points highlighted, not to scale. Here we are today, 2020. I'll be looking back a bit to 2005. Why I start there, I'll explain shortly. And I'm looking forwards, possibly 100 years to when cryonics is a successful enterprise, a clearly successful enterprise. It might be sooner, of course, if there is something akin to a technological singularity in the middle of the century, or it might take a lot longer to achieve the goal. In fact, it might never come, of course. The goal that there is frequent, successful reanimation of people who have been cryopreserved in the present day and in adjacent decades. But I'm not looking so much at that possible future. As a futurist, I want to focus on how we can get there. So I'm going to look at what might be possible in around 15 years from now. I did say this chart was not to scale. In 15 years, perhaps, it might be possible that cryonics has moved from its present status today as being a very fringe activity with only slight interest, often comic interest from the mainstream. It will have changed into being a regular part of the mainstream culture with close interoperation, close integration between standard medical procedures and standard medical personnel and those taking part in cryopreservation. At the same time, there could be a major change in public attitude, which I'll be talking about. But that's 15 years in the future. Can we concentrate on what we should be doing in the shorter term? If foresight is just talking about the distant future, it has failed. The point of futurism and foresight is to get people to change what they do in the present term, in the present timescale, to increase the chances of attractive futures longer term. So what might happen in the next 5 years? And of course, we can talk about, as has already been mentioned in this conference, the possibility of more funds being invested in research and development, the possibility of more well-known public figures, celebrities of various sorts, influencing people to take cryonics seriously. But how could we get these outcomes to happen? So I'm going to be looking at a couple of things we might do in the next few years, which basically will come down to reducing some of the negatives of current cryonics and accentuating the positives. But before we get there, I want to look backwards. Good foresight is grounded in good hindsight. I'm going to claim, and this is where I might be wrong, that not much has changed in the world of cryonics in the last 15 years. I picked this date because I remember reading the book, The First Immortal by James Halperin 15 years ago. In fact, this is a screenshot from Amazon, which reminded me when I bought this book. It's a book that sets out lots of issues about cryonics in a fictionalized form. I remember discussing this with my son at the time, and I certainly was looking at cryonics before then and afterwards. But what has happened in these 15 years? In some ways, there has been tremendous changes. Smartphones, computers, networks have come along in leaps and bounds. Artificial intelligence moved from being hyped and disappointing to being transformational in many fields. Renewable energy has plunged in prices more than most people forecast. There's been rapid changes in genetic sequencing, reprogramming of genetics, synthetic biology, and yes, a surge of interest in many aspects of rejuvenation biotechnology. We haven't conquered aging yet, but there have been many very fascinating steps forwards. That's in the wider field, but in the world of cryonics, I think, and some people may prove me wrong, I think there's been a limited additional interest compared to what was 15 years ago. Limited additional funding, little breakthroughs in advocacy for cryonics. And yes, there are good arguments, but most of these good arguments existed 15 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 45 years ago. And there have been some changes. There's been some breakthroughs in the evidence for what we might call digital cryonics, in which brains are put into this state from which they'll never recover biologically, but they might have their data read out and transformed into running on the cloud. So that has changed in the last 15 years. And there have been some interesting experiments. For example, the memory retention in C. elegans worms. But this has not yet scaled to larger organisms or larger organs. So if it is true that there has been little progress in the last 15 years, what are the grounds for thinking there might be better progress of the sort I have referred to in the next 15 years? And of course, futurists often talk about exponential progress. It's often said that disruptive changes go through a long period of disappointment before they become devastating. And so the trajectory in that case is slow, 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 faster, faster, faster. But on the other hand, I have to say from my experience in business, most so-called disruptions fail. Most interesting ideas never really take off, and the trajectory instead is slow, 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 slower, stop. And many companies, as I've said, died in the so-called chasm or in the valley of death. Many industries that people expected to progress have not progressed as expected. For example, there has not been much progress in supersonic jet airliners since my childhood. What's happened with nuclear fusion? Well, it's still perhaps 25 years in the future. What's happened with blockchain? Slow, slow, slow. So how can we tell the difference between the trajectory that cryonics may be on? Can we identify seeds of tipping points? Can we go beyond fatalistic observation? Can we get involved as an activist in encouraging seeds of tipping points? So I'm going to refer, as I said, to two possible sorts. Those that take the friction and the slowdowns and negativity out of the current cryonics world, and those that accentuate positive evidence. In terms of reducing friction, let's look first at reducing the awkward need to have to travel to another country to die if you were signed up. It is good news that there is possibly a growth in the provision of local providers, such as EBF in Central Europe, and I think we're going to be hearing about others tomorrow and throughout this conference too. So that is an encouraging step forwards. So of course, throughout most of cryonics history, there's been lots of plans for local providers. Are things going to be better this time? It's still hard to say, but it certainly would be better if there were simpler standby procedures, and one other headache could be solved, which is the worry that if you die, you might become brain impaired in the process. It would be far better if in some ways there was support, legal support for cryoeuthanasia. Controversial and difficult topic, but one that we need to keep on the discussion. What about having more confidence in cryonics organizations? Very often when I mention cryonics, even to people who are positive about futurism generally, they will say, oh, wishful thinking, some of these guys are cowboys, some of these guys can't be trusted. And it's for a long time been discussed that maybe there could be some independent verification of cryonics organizations meeting some agreed standards. Again, though, this has not moved forwards as fast as some of us might have hoped. Then there's one cause of cryocrastination, which is the worry that you might sign up for the wrong organization. You might sign up for the best organization today, but in the future there might be some better option. And if that's not solved, there is a logic to cryocrastination, and the logic is a good design principle that you should defer as long as possible the design choice when it's unclear which is the best option. If, on the other hand, it was easier to switch cryonics providers, and I know some people will tell me it probably is already, but that would get rid of that negativity. What about the costs? This was one of the subjects, of course, in the last talk. Sometimes people say, oh, of course, we're going to reduce the costs via scale effects. And I saw in the chat a few minutes ago a reference to a paper by Ralph Merkel, who said that once there are millions of people being cryopreserved, the cost could come down to as little as $3,000 per full body process. So yes, many industries have benefited from scale effects, from learning effects, from practice makes perfect. If there are lots of people going through the process, then there is scope for innovation and things can indeed come down in price, just as what happened in the world of smartphones, which moved from being incredibly expensive, only affordable by rich yuppies and drug dealers and business people who had far more money than sense, to a situation when even the poorest in the world can have a pretty good smartphone. In fact, a much better smartphone than these early adopters. But, you know, that needs these scale effects to kick in, and there are currently very few people being cryonically preserved every year. It's probably just a score or two at most. So there's not much prospects for that cost coming down anytime soon by that mechanism. Another means in industry, in general, where technological costs come down, is by better integration, avoiding expensive handoffs, duplication between different groups of people, complicated connections. Ideally, we would integrate the work of cryonics volunteers with the work of existing medical professionals. But as we heard, the mainstream medicine currently has a low regard for cryonics. Often it's a grudging relationship. And so that needs to be solved before we can expect the cost to come down by that route. Then the other mechanism in industry is you can bring down the cost of your own projects by piggybacking, by taking advantage of other initiatives. And there is some encouragement here, as we have heard in the previous talks in this conference, the possibility of reduced costs of cryopreservations of organs that could lead in turn to better mechanisms for cryopreserving the whole body, or at least the skull. So there's some prospects there, but it is still moving painfully slowly. Then there's another argument that says, well, the costs aren't that much. Let's just go on the offensive here. Let's defend the costs of cryonics. And I have some sympathy with that. I had the argument the other day that it's cheaper to cryonically preserve yourself than do what is currently quite a fashionable thing, which is to scatter your ashes into space. Turns out that was an exaggerated claim. I looked up online. There are companies that will put your ashes into space for as little as 2,000 UK pounds. And in fact, they even offer a cheaper version where a ceremonial portion of your ashes are put into at least a trajectory to take you into space and then down again. So I don't think that's a good comparison. And in any case, that mechanism has clear evidence that it works in its own terms, whereas with cryonics, the costs are much higher, and it is completely unclear to most people whether there is any evidence of it ever working. So when we compare cryonics with open heart surgery, which costs what, about $100,000, or with heart transplants, which can cost upwards of $1 million, again, the comparison doesn't really work because there is good evidence that lives can be saved, that QALY can be increased, quality adjusted life years, whereas with cryonics, there is still the worry that portions of your family wealth will be tied up potentially indefinitely that could be put to other clearly beneficial purposes. So we need more evidence to transform that equation. And here's my brief assessment of the evidence that's been pursued recently. There is a good structure of preserved brains, at least in some cases by CT scans, but not at the level that can give us confidence that the memories and consciousness could be brought back. And indeed, there is better evidence of preserved brains for what I've called digital cryonics rather than biological cryonics. But hopefully we'll hear better about that shortly. We've heard about reanimation of animals from reduced temperatures, from extreme hibernation, but not as low as the -130 degrees of liquid nitrogen. And we have to beware extrapolation. This is suggestive, but that's at most. And as for reanimation of animals larger than the C. elegans worm, there doesn't seem to be realistic prospects of that happening anytime soon. A lot of the research in this seems to date back to the 1970s or 80s. So what's a reasonable next step there? The best I think we can hope for is reanimation of organs from radically reduced temperatures, and the work that has been referred to already, which is understanding how to limit damage from the various antifreeze mechanisms. So that takes me on to my last two slides as a kind of summary. How can we change public opinion on this? And it's my observation that most people, when they think about cryonics, including many of us in the cryonics community, we are in any case in two minds about this whole enterprise. On the one hand, we say, yes, it would be great to be able to meet our loved ones again, and great to see the future. And it's just wrong that people are penalized for dying at the wrong time, whereas if they were able to live longer, they would have a much longer lifespan. But at the same time as we have these optimistic thoughts, there is the counteracting thoughts that my family will think I'm crazy, my family will think I am selfish, and indeed the main pressure from society is the expectation that we should pass on our savings to other people when we die rather than keep them locked up. And we might even think that we ourselves are being deluded. But this dichotomy, the balance can be changed if we have a better narrative about how a future society can be realized in which it is able and willing to reanimate us, where there is more positive evidence that can reduce the fear of us being deluded or our family members being deluded. Indeed, positive evidence that can inspire people to be more courageous, to become strong, positive advocates for cryopreservation, so that we will then collectively say, no, this viewpoint that society expects us to pass on our savings to others when we die, on the contrary, society should increasingly expect us to give our loved ones, our family members, a good chance to live again. So I refer to ancient philosophers who have said, and here's a picture of a Greek philosopher, though I might have had a picture of the Buddha here or many others instead. It is sometimes said by them that the main task in life is to prepare for death. I've never liked that sentiment. I've often retorted that the main task in life is to live with a flourishing abundance. But perhaps we can look ahead to something a bit in between, that by 5 to 15 years, more and more people will say the main task in life, or maybe not the main task, but a vital task in life, is to prepare for a successful cryopreservation. That we will say to each other, have you got your pension plan? Have you written a will? And where is your cryopreservation facilities? And if we don't do that, we will feel irresponsible. So these are my remarks, and I'm more than interested in the questions that may turn up. Thank you so much.
David, thanks a lot for this great talk. Due to the time limitations, we will only do one question now and then postpone the other questions to the end of the conference. And the question is, in your opinion, which of the following methods is more likely to allow you to see the 23rd century? Cryonics, mind uploading, or anti-aging? We can't hear you right now, at least I can't. So,
your opinion, which of the
So I'm
good.
about 25% optimistic that anti-aging will arrive in good time for my own life. I say it's about a 50% chance it will arrive by the middle of the century, and there's about a 50% chance I'll still be alive by then. I multiply these probabilities together and get a 25% chance. In terms of the possibilities of cryonics working, I haven't got a good figure for that, but it's probably at most 25% too. So there's another chance. As for mind uploading, I remain skeptical about that, and I will remain skeptical until AIs probably teach me the right philosophy of mind that will give me the confidence that if my mind is uploaded, it will be me rather than an alien copy of me.
Fair enough. Thanks a lot for the insight.